Hello, everyone. Welcome, very warm welcome to our roundtable on the Summit of the Future, which is an event organized by the Earth System Governance Taskforce on the Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Caroline Sennett, and I will chair this session together with my colleagues and co-conveners of the task force, Thomas Hickman and Yixin Sun. So last month, the United Nations Summit, the United Nations convened the Summit of the Future, and some of you have traveled all the way to New York to take part in this high-level event, which was framed as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to enhance cooperation, reaffirm existing commitments towards the SDGs, and address gaps in global governance. This summit was seen by many as the moment to renew global governance for sustainable development so as to make it fit for tackling the pressing issues of our time. And today we have 5 distinguished speakers with us, all top experts in the field of global sustainability governance, to discuss and reflect upon the outcomes of the Summit of the Future. So after short inputs from the panelists and reflections based on a series of guiding questions from the moderators, we will invite people in the audience to also share their experiences and ask questions. So for the Q&A session, we kindly ask you to type your comment or question in the chat and indicate to which panelist it is addressed, as well as your name and affiliation. And you will also be able to ask your question directly if you wish to. But without further ado, I would suggest that we move to the first part of this roundtable and start with a broad question on the process and outcomes of the Summit of the Future. And first on our panel, we have Marianne Beisheim. Marianne is a senior associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. She has been following negotiations on sustainable development at UN level for many years, and since the adoption of the SDGs, she's focusing in particular on the follow-up and review of the 2030 Agenda at the UN High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. Marianne, you were in New York last month to attend the Summit of the Future. What is your overall impression of the process and outcome of the summit?
Thank you very much, Carol Ann. Well, we have a pact, and the pact is called a Pact for the Future. It has 2 annexes, a Declaration on Future Generations and a Global Digital Compact. And during a side event in New York, we used songs to describe the summit, song titles. And first, for the negotiations, I think with the Beatles, you could sort of say a long and winding road. It took 2 years to really negotiate these documents all in all. And because of the modalities resolution, in the end, the negotiators had to find consensus. And therefore, for the result, you could sort of say with the Rolling Stones, you can't always get what you want, right? So it's rather the lowest common denominator because of that requirement to find consensus. So really after long and indeed very tough negotiations, they were also closed to non-state actors, so it was hard to follow. We had all in all 6 revised draft versions of this pact after the 0 draft of the pact. You could say that I think the first revised version was the most ambitious one, and the adopted version at least was still more ambitious than the 0 draft. Thanks to many champion states in the negotiations, especially from the global south, like Costa Rica, Mexico, Singapore, we really have a pact. But even before this pact got adopted, I think we have an innovation that we had 2 action days before the summit that were open to civil society and other non-state actors in the United Nations headquarters. I heard that 7,000 participants were registered. So that's really a huge number. And I think it's sort of a new standard that before a summit, just like last year with the SDG summit, that the UN opens up to non-state actors and really discusses what is about to be adopted. During the summit, for me, the most exciting part was the minutes, the moments before the actual adoptions, because you could say there were last-minute spoiler efforts by the Russian Federation and some others. First, there were many so-called silence breaks on the documents to be adopted. And then last minute, there was an amendment tabled that was then countered by a no action motion by the African group. So it was really exciting in the end. 143 member states said, no, we indeed want this pact to be adopted. And so in the end, there was a sense of relief that really the pact and its 2 annex documents could be adopted. For me as a scientist, this was interesting because I think the pact versus this amendment that was tabled gives you 2 very different visions of the future of multilateralism. The Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and this majority of member states said, we want a more effective, more networked and inclusive multilateralism, whereas the amendment said, we don't want any intervention in internal affairs. We want no so-called duplication of efforts, more or less saying we don't want to discuss climate change in the Security Council. And we think the UN should be driven by intergovernmental, purely intergovernmental decision-making. That means no non-state participation beyond mere consultations along the ECOSOC rules. So this really makes a big difference. And for me, so the summit stands for these 2 different versions of the future of multilateralism. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Marianne, for sharing these initial insights about the summit. Next on our panel is Pamela Chasek. Pam is Professor of International Relations and Environmental Politics at Manhattan University in the United States. She is a renowned expert on international negotiations on sustainable development and has published many books and articles on the SDGs, developing country capacity building for environmental negotiations, scientific uncertainty in negotiations, and various environmental treaties and negotiating processes. Pam is also co-founder and executive director of the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, which is an independent reporting service on United Nations environment and development negotiations. Pam, can I dare say that you know all the corridors of the United Nations headquarters by heart, and you've attended the Summit of the Future as well. What is your overall impression of the process and outcome of this summit?
Okay, in clarity, first, I'm executive editor, not executive director. Someone might be upset by that, but I physically did not go to UN headquarters for the Summit of the Future. I stayed home, which is about 200 blocks north of UN headquarters. Having lived in that neighborhood for many years, I try to avoid it during high-level meetings like this, but I watched online. I had a team of people for the Earth Negotiations Bulletin who were there, and we chatted constantly throughout, and I did edit our report. So one of the things, I just want to build off something that Mariana said, 2 things. One is that thank you for the song titles. As someone who has used song titles in multiple things, I love it. The second thing, with regard to the Russian Federation's attempts at the very beginning of the summit, when you were describing it, it sounded to me a little bit like fear of global governance moving towards global government, and that the UN needs to sort of maintain this balance. And therein lies a lot of the problems with the Summit of the Future and in those negotiations, is how much can they actually do without veering into sort of more of global government. So in the couple minutes that I have, I just wanted to actually go towards the substance of the Pact for the Future for a moment. And so, you know, I'm going to mention a few things that were good about the outcome and a few things that I fear are missing. The first, as Mariana just mentioned, that language was agreed for actually a more representative, inclusive, transparent, efficient, I'm quoting, effective, democratic, and accountable UN Security Council. And these are key issues that many member states have been pushing for decades and have not made any progress on. Second, there's a whole section of the report devoted to science. We don't usually see that in UN outcomes. And so that's a positive. The Global Digital Compact, which was one of the annexes of the Pact of the Future, is the first global agreement regulating artificial intelligence. I wouldn't argue that it's regulating, but it's the first agreement on artificial intelligence that we've gotten out of UN headquarters, and the idea of ensuring technology benefits for everyone. The fourth is the Declaration on Future Generations. And I remember from Rio Plus 20, where they were trying, a lot of youth delegates were trying to get an ombudsperson or someone on behalf of future generations, and that failed. So here, this is the first time that many countries at the highest political level have committed to take the interests of future generations into account in policy and decision making. And finally, with regard to the SDGs and climate, the real focus was on finance, I think, in this, at least in my opinion, and the commitments for financing for sustainable development, which is setting the stage for the 2025 Financing for Development Conference, and also for upcoming climate finance discussions. And so I don't have time to go into all of the different things on finance, but I'm sure we'll discuss that as we go forward. What is missing quickly? Didn't really move the needle on peace and security in any significant way. In Pact Actions 9 and 10, language on international environmental governance was watered down, despite many persuasive and urgently needed options. As a result, not only does the Pact fail to dedicate a chapter to governance of the environment, but where environmental references are mainstreamed, little is achieved in terms of operational or even conceptual breakthroughs. The final version of the Pact, number 3, also removed Action 32, which would have facilitated critical technology transfers in developing countries while safeguarding intellectual property rights. And then the final setback for proponents of a multilateral system capable of convening powerful states and non-state actors was cutting the term emergency platforms in Action 54, while member states still continue to back key elements of this proposal from Antonio Guterres to better respond to complex global shocks, including in areas ranging from food and energy insecurity to financial meltdowns and environmental disasters. So that sort of limits what the UN can do in these areas. Once again, going back to that governance to government continuum. So those are my initial comments.
Great. Thanks a lot, Pam, for your initial analysis of the process and outcomes of this summit. With us today is also Margarita Gomez. Margarita is the Executive Director of Southern Voice, which is an open platform for think tanks from the Global South that contributes to the global dialogue on the SDGs. Margarita has worked with governments, international organizations, and key stakeholders to strengthen equitable and inclusive governance worldwide. Margarita, what is your overall impression of the process and outcome of this summit?
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and share some of the insights and perspective that we have from the Global South. And I would like to highlight 3 main insights. So the first one is the different expectations and expectatives that there are from the Global North and the multilateral UN agencies and the expectations that are coming from the Global South. And on the one hand, and I think that it's important to to put this and make this very clear, these differences, because on the one hand, we have very high expectations coming from the UN agencies and actors in New York. We have phrases such as bringing multilateralism back. We have phrases such as laying the foundations for sustainable, just, and peaceful global order. And really, it's a very ambitious pact with 56 actions that target and that cover different topics from global governance, climate change, digital cooperation. So that's on one hand that what we see there, even not just in the Summit of the Future, but in the whole 2-year process of the negotiation. And on the other hand, we have the Global South with more moderate, on the Global South actors with more moderated expectatives and with a very clear claim. The claim was, we want to be more influential and we want to be heard and we want to bring our priorities to the whole discussion. And this takes me to the process. And the process, I think, and this is my second message, the whole process felt a little more inclusive in terms of more voices, part of the process from the Global South, India, Brazil, and different actors having a very active role there. Civil society, there were many tons of spaces to provide inputs, to participate in the whole discussion of the draft. However, as we were closer to the end, all these inputs started to disseminate and to dilute. And at the end, the feeling and the perception is that the influence that we had as Global South and also as civil society and think tank, it was very limited. And also, and this is my final message regarding the outcomes. And regarding the outcomes, the feeling is that we have this clear path with, as I said, 56 actions that are very general, that in certain way lack of more actionable items to define how we are going to achieve these goals. And in terms of the substance, the topics, there were some key topics left a little behind or just covered in very general. One is, how can we create a more egalitarian multilateral system? How can we develop and really change and influence a global financial system that can deliver for all? And finally, some priorities, as Pamela was mentioning, the artificial intelligence regulation that was very pushed by some of the countries, for example, Mexico, in the discussions, how can we regulate that? Social justice when we talk about climate change. And yeah, I'm going to stop here and then we can discuss a little more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margarita, for your initial comments on the process and outcomes of the summit, specifically related to Global South countries. Next on our panel is Amandine Orsini. Amandine is a professor of political science at UC Louvain Saint-Louis Bruxelles in Belgium and a senior research fellow of the Earth System Governance Project. She's also a long-standing expert of global politics in the field of sustainable development. She conducts various research projects on the role and influence of youth in sustainable development diplomacy and has extensively published on the topic, including on the role of youth in the negotiations on the Sustainable Development Goals. Amandine, could you please give us your take on the process and outcome of the Summit of the Future?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. Unfortunately, I also have to say that I haven't been able to participate in the Summit of the Future due to a conflict of agenda. So I'm more competent to analyze the preparation to the summit, and this is something I'm going to talk about now, and maybe in the next questions, the outcome. and especially, as you mentioned, from the perspective of youth, because I am studying youth as one of the major groups that is involved in sustainable development governance since 1992. So my overall impression is that the summit has been perceived as an important step to prepare, and I would say both within governments, and we've mentioning several governments already, but also within civil society, because it has been seen as a milestone, and especially the idea to work on the future has been very federative. For youth especially, it's, as was mentioned, I think, by Pam, future generations, and if you look at the definition of sustainable development, is already including the dimension of future generations. But so far, we did not really have progress on that issue, and on that, the pact and also the two declarations are a major evolution. I also wanted to say that I agree that the results are limited because it's the, as was explained, what states could agree on. It might not be, but I must say, looking at youth, that preparing the summit was also very important in producing new ideas. If I look at youth, and the first Marianne mentioned that it's actually a 2-year process, the adoption of the pact. Youth have been conducting major consultations on the zero draft of the Summit of the Future. They have been producing a response to the zero draft, and I'm speaking about the youth major group, but I'm sure the other major groups also worked on this. And this draft was, this response to the draft was elaborated by more than 2,000 youth-led and youth-focused organizations worldwide. So again, showing the interest for the summit. What they also did was, like always, produce another document which was entitled Voices of Youth. And the second document is more the results of a consultative process within the ECOSOC, because there is the ECOSOC Youth Forum 2024. And again, with the idea to include voices from Global North Youth, Global South Youth, and suggest some measures. As was mentioned already, the pact is mentioning youth several times. There is even a full section, I can detail after that, on youth and future generations, which is a major step forward, at least for the youth constituency, and also the declaration for future generations. So from my perspective, it has been a major milestone in trying to think about time, age, youth, and how do we deal with long-term problems and maybe problems facing that future generations will face. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Amandine, for your initial comments on this summit, specifically the process related to the interests of the youth constituency that you analyze in your research. Last but not least, on our panel is Sébastien Treillet. Sébastien is the Executive Director of IDRI, the Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relations, which is a Paris-based think tank working on international governance of climate, biodiversity, ocean, and sustainability. He is a specialist in foresight for public policies and international negotiations on sustainable development, and a member of the lead faculty of the Earth System Governance Project. Sébastien, what is your overall impression of the process and outcomes of the Summit of the Future?
Thank you very much, Caroline, and it's a pleasure to be with all these panelists this afternoon. I'm going to try and use the lens of the reform of the international financial system as a way to qualify the outcome, and I can come back into details into the results of that. But what I wanted to say is that in the preparatory process, there was a very interesting policy brief being prepared by the UN SDG services that was acknowledging the structural asymmetries in the global economic system, not just the Bretton Woods institution, but the global economic system. And it was a program that was utopian, but extremely interesting. And I thought, that's interesting, but to what extent is that going to be accepted in the negotiation process? And so at some point, because the reform of the international financial architecture that is to some extent limited to the multilateral development bank system and the IMF and the World Bank, that process that is ongoing since the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, has pushed a lot the idea that we needed to have an overhaul of the whole system. That was then also followed by President Ruto from Kenya, by Macron, and even last week by Chancellor Scholz in the Hamburg Sustainability Conference. There is a whole stream of discussion on that side that is not progressing radically, but only very incrementally. One of the expectations of the people in that field was maybe the Summit of the Future is the moment for an overhaul, where the heads of state would be giving the political impetus to say, we need to really change that system radically, because if it's only the ministries of finance that discuss that reform of the international financial architecture, that generally say that it's too complicated to change. And so we had expected, some people in this community had expected the Summit of the Future to be a moment of a political change that would really put the impetus towards something completely different, in line with the initial policy brief that was extremely utopian, but at least gave a meaning or a type of a direction. And so we could have expected that type of political pressure to come out of the Summit of the Future. And actually, this is not what happened. No surprise, but this is not what happened. And what we see is rather a minimal type of change or contribution. And I really talk about that part of the pact, because on future generation, this is something that has, I think, a lot of is really meaningful. On that side of the inequalities in the global economic system, what we have is at least a declaration part, the first part of the pact. That is not too bad, but actually you see that was tried there is to at least defend that the declaration and the political statement is not worse than before, that it at least at the same level as what we had last year in the high-level political forum on SDGs, or with the SDGs themselves. So trying to at least maintain the idea that sustainable development is an investment that we all need to do, and that investing in southern countries is an investment and not just a purely solidarity and moral issues. That would already be a lot. So that the political declaration, I probably see that a lot of people have been defending that it's not too bad. And in that regard, the statement is there again, that there is still support for the SDG agenda. And then on the more instrumental part, on the outcomes, what we can see is that many people have tried to use the Summit of the Future as one of the moments where we discuss politically the reform of the international financial architecture. The next one was last week in Hamburg, and then the next one is next week in Washington, and the next one is COP29. So it's just one milestone. I'm sorry to really downsize the expectations about the Summit of the Future, but on that line, it was just one moment in New York, and actually what happened was probably more on the sidelines in the corridors, because a lot of the problem, and I think it was already, I think it was Margarita alluding to that, it's not the UN system that can decide on things that are discussed in Washington. And so it was complicated to see how these elements can be operationalized. But I come back to some extent, the discourse is already quite important, but not decisive in the reform of this international financial system.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Sebastian, for your critical view on the outcomes of this summit. Thanks a lot to you all for sharing your initial insights about the process and outcomes of this summit. And now I will hand over to my colleague Thomas, and we can go a bit more into detail in the next round.
Thanks, Caroline. And I now start the second round of questions. And once again, I invite everyone in the room here to also ask questions in the Q&A box. This is the plan for the third round. But now starting the second round, and again with Marianne. And it was nice to hear all your deep reflections about the Summit of the Future. But then, Marianne, you also mentioned already a bit the longer process, the 2 years leading up to the Summit of the Future. And we wanted to hear from you a bit more about these obstacles and maybe also some enabling factors on the way towards New York? What were the main problems and maybe also main promises that we could look at the Summit of the Future?
Okay, thank you, Thomas. I think there were many issues and problems around questions of sovereignty, as Pamela mentioned, right? And some questioning whether we are going too much from global governance to a world government. For example, the new president of Argentina, Milei, he dissociated from the pact because he said this is too totalitarian. He feels the UN is taking over. We had similar discussions here with our right-wing populist party in Germany. So that was like a major conflict line. But allow me to turn your question a bit around, because I think there was one big agreement here, and that was that the pact really should create an enabling environment for an accelerated implementation of the SDGs. That was something that was very clear to the G77, first of all, but also all other member states, I think, could agree on this. And so this enabling environment, that was a common thread, so to speak, that went through all of the pact and also the two documents in the annex. And we already heard the many issues that were covered in the pact, starting with in the first chapter, the access to finance, like Sebastian explained, that this was a lot about how to make a reality what the Secretary General suggested in terms of an SDG stimulus. Not many member states were very willing to fully embrace this, at least on the side of the donor countries, because of all the issues they have now with finding enough money in their budgets. But also other issues were discussed, like international tax cooperation, the consideration of a tax on high net worth individuals, on millionaires and billionaires, something coming also from the G20. The SG was tasked with a report on the impact of military spending on the implementation of the SDGs. Also, he was tasked to create a panel on finding new indicators for the measurement of sustainable development beyond GDP. And as Sebastian also explained, the reform of the international financial architecture, World Bank, the IMF, the Intergovernmental Monetary Fund, reforming the debt architecture, the additionality of climate finance. So the whole package of everything about finance and means of implementation was one thing that member states really wanted to push forward. We have some good language there, but it's not like a huge breakthrough, let me put it that way. The second chapter, peace and security, was very difficult. Well, obviously, given the current situation, but we have some language around peacekeeping and peace building. I think it's not very hard to explain that in an environment where you don't have peace, sustainable development is very hard to achieve. You can see that in all the data. As Pam already pointed out, disarmament was a major conflict issue, so the language there is very weak, unfortunately. But we have some commitment to prevention plans to reduce all forms of violence and the protection of civilians. The third chapter was around digital and the Global Digital Compact in the annex. So commitments about closing digital divides, investing in public digital infrastructure, and the whole discussion how to reap the benefits of technological innovations and digitalization, including artificial intelligence. Also something that wasn't too easy, because technology transfer is always a big conflictual issue in the United Nations, how to best deal with the transfer of technologies. And also the discussion about the downsides of digital innovations like disinformation and misinformation, for example, in social media, was an issue of discussion. And in a side event, the president of the Club of Rome, Sandrine Dixon de Clèves, said something that I found very interesting. She said that she feels the relevance of science is declining in the discussion around sustainable development because there's so much competition with alternative narratives in social media. So the pact and also the digital compact speaks about that. And I think that is very good also in terms of enabling environment. And last but not least, chapters 4 and 5, we heard discuss how to future-proof decision-making. At the Hamburg Sustainability Conference, we heard that the Secretary General will actually go forward in having an envoy on future generations, which is good news. To deal with complex shocks and new and emerging issues is something that is already mentioned in the 2030 agenda. And we have now maybe a bit more on the how. And I agree absolutely with Pam. It's totally disappointing that the right to a safe and clean environment that was in one of the drafts on the way to the final pact got kicked out again. And also the strengthening of the UN's Environmental Assembly got kicked out on the way. And the language on transitioning away from fossil fuels got considerably weakened. That's another negative here.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks for these another round of deep insights into what has been negotiated in New York. I give it over to Caroline again.
Yes, thanks, Thomas. And the next question is for Pamela, right? And you've touched upon this already a bit in your initial comments. So one of the key elements of the Pact of the Future relates to transforming global governance, right? So what's your take on the capacity of this summit and its outcome to steer a global governance reform that is a bit more equitable, inclusive, and effective? So I think that in the discussions, the prospects are bleak, but what's your analysis? Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I agree with your bleakness. I didn't expect much from this, to be perfectly honest. Maybe I've gotten a bit more than a bit cynical over time, but the one thing that I've learned is that you know when you're negotiating something that is a declaration or a pact, it's supposed to symbolize political will, but the most important thing is you can't expect big change out of a single summit. It does create space for action, but the question is, how is that action going to actually happen? Will coalitions of member states and others work with the necessary energy and ambition to take forward any of these proposals for reforms, of which many of them were weakened, as has been noted by the other panelists? So you need really a sustained member state coalition made up of both, with leadership from both North and South, to deliver, but also you need wider constituencies, academia, civil society, youth, business, citizen organizations to actually push this forward. If we leave it to heads of state, if we leave it to the United Nations alone, nothing will really happen. So as the UN reaches its 80th anniversary next year, we need progress at every milestone ahead of the official follow-up meeting to this in 2028. We can't just start thinking about it in 2027. So a couple things, I'm going to try to avoid what other people have said because some of my talking points have already been made. But what I found was in statements and in the document, Security Council and financial reform received the most attention. Much more than environment, much more, and mind you, financial reform is enabling for the SDGs. So actions 38 through 41 all address various issues with Security Council reform. Calls for addressing the historic lack of representation for Africa, where front and center in many of the speeches and is contained in the document. Talk of enlarging the council and addressing the problem of the veto were referenced, but there's really no consensus. And we have to remember there have been calls for Security Council reform, along with ECOSOC reform, along with General Assembly reform, almost since the very beginning. At least ECOSOC reform goes back, I think, to the very beginning of the UN. The challenge is, getting, are you going to make changes to the charter? Are you going to open up the charter? And in the current geopolitical climate, would that even work? What would we end up with? Plus, we also have to remember that according to the charter, any changes to the charter can be vetoed by the 5 veto states in the Security Council. And Russia has demonstrated that it is not in favor of many of these reforms. So there have been proposals of how to get around the charter in doing this, but it's going to really take political will and a lot of lobbying to get that done. Sebastian has really talked about the financial architecture. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of points there, hopefully not repeating too much of what he said. But actions 47 through 52 address the need to reform the international financial architecture. And most notably, when you're talking about governance, increasing the voice of the Global South in financial governance, as well as accelerating reform of the architecture so it can actually meet the urgent challenge of climate change, in terms of climate finance, adaptation financing, clean energy technologies, improved risk assessment. And there's also calls for the private sector to scale up support for the SDGs and climate. And I don't remember, maybe it was Mariana who said about the challenge of getting financing from governments right now is harder than ever before. And when you have to bring in additional sources of funding beyond governments. And that needs to come from philanthropies and the private sector, and how, the UN can't tell them what to do. They're not member states, but can encourage. It was already mentioned about changing the indicators of sustainable development in Action 53, so I will skip over that one for now. And finally, other sections address governance reform of the General Assembly, ECOSOC, the Peacebuilding Commission, human rights, outer space law, and partnerships. But most of the language is pretty general and doesn't really, it's going to take a lot more than, of discussions and coming up with more specific proposals that were taken out of previous drafts and previous proposals, and how to get that back in to move forward. So I can address anything more specifically in the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Pam, for your more fine-grained analysis. So we can see this summit and this pact as a first step, right, towards launching the efforts for renewing or reforming global governance for sustainable development. We can either see the glass half full or half empty, of course. But next, I would like to ask a question to Margarita, right? Developing countries are extensively cited throughout the pact for the future. You've discussed it a bit already in your initial analysis, which I would like you to go more into details about the key outcomes of the summit for the Global South, and maybe also what's missing, right, in the pact, what interests are not represented.
Thank you, Carol. So great to hear many different insights here. As I said, there were very high expectations on the path, and I think that is a historical moment to the path, to what the path brings in terms of to look to the future. I will highlight 3 main messages here. And the first one, and this is echoing what Pamela was saying, is how do we move from words to action? And I'm going to develop this a little more in the next section where we are going to discuss the way forward. But I think that that is key, because there are many good and many many key topics covered by the path. But as I said in my first intervention, one of the challenges is how we are going to implement this. How are we going to achieve this? And in terms of the outcomes, one of the three key, there are specific topics that we found very interesting and that resonate a lot with the Global South priorities. So one is gender. As we can see in the path, gender is crucial. There are the reduction of legal, social, and economic barriers, addressing sexual and gender-based violence, increasing investment to close the gender gap, the control the land access. And these are issues that we have been worrying, and these are priorities across many countries in the Global South. How can we reduce the barrier to access to credit and other financial services? How can we increase the land ownership also that needs to be accelerated? We know that just women just have access to the land ownership, 15% of the women have that access. So these are huge issues for the Global South, and the path opened that discussion and give some guidance to discuss a little more with the countries and governments in the Global South. In the digital part, there is the other topic that was important for us. The digital compact give a lot of a good framework about this discussion. Maybe something that governments were pushing from the Global South were pushing a little more. It was, how can we regulate? And there were some pushback about the regulation of artificial intelligence, because that could interfere with some governance, internal decision, internal affairs. So that is an important topic that wasn't really very deep. The discussion in the path is not there. The other topic that it was important, as Sebastian was saying, is financial for development. So the path gave a general framework about the financing for development, but there are key issues that were missed. For example, clear commitments about reforming the financing for development system. The debt is a key issue. It's mentioned there, and there was a lot of discussion on debt, but that is one of the biggest challenges for the Global South, how developed countries are managing the debt issue. And then climate change, that's another important outcome for the Global South. The recognition is very important, the recognition to conserving, protecting, and restoring the nature and ecosystems. Something that is important to bring a little more is, what are the priorities from the Global South? And in this term, when we talk about the priorities of the Global South, we need to talk about social justice. We need to talk about governance of the climate change, and we need to connect, and this is mentioned in the path, the climate change with finance. And finally, there is the poverty issue, and poverty is mentioned there related with food security and how can we reduce hunger. And this is a huge issue for Africa, Asia, some places, some countries in Latin America. Something that is interesting, and that from the Global South we were discussing, and we think that need to bring a little more to discussion, is when we talk about poverty, we need also to talk about economic growth, industrialization, employment, local innovations, and that is something that is not very salient in the path. And maybe my final comment on this point is, and just want to echo also what Pamela mentioned, is the importance of science and innovation. And science and innovation wasn't mentioned that much before, but now is there. And I think that this is also a response of the lack of trust in science, and that the separation between science and policy is happening a little more, and then the polarization and fake news that are happening there. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Margarita, for emphasizing the key priorities for the Global South, those that are included in the pact, but also those that are missing. And I hand over to Thomas again.
Thanks for the question for Amandine. And you mentioned in your opening statement already that youth topics are covered in the Pact of the Future. At the same time, we know from studies, also your own research, that there's a shrinking space for youth actors, and they also face serious challenges when being in these high-level meetings, international negotiations, also climate change, biodiversity loss, and other occasions. Could you elaborate a bit on the role of youth as an engine for perhaps pushing for more ambitious agreements to achieve sustainable development?
Yes, thank you very much for your question. I think I could start by explaining why I'm studying youth and why I think youth is central. It's as I said, it's related to the need for a reflection on the long term, on time, on emergency, and that's also the case here for the SDGs, for accelerating their implementation. But I also think it's a matter for inclusion. Youth is one of the major groups representing civil society, but it's not just that. So maybe I should also have started by just defining youth, which is difficult because there is no unique definition at the level of the United Nations. But more or less, youth is an age group ending at 35 years old. I mean, for climate change, it's 35 years old, and for the United Nations, usually it's 30. Meaning, I'm not talking about children here. I'm actually talking about young people. Very important, because if you look at the world population, youth is actually a majority. The median age worldwide is 32. Another key element, I think, even if it might look like a sideline issue compared to security, to all the things we've mentioned, geopolitics, military. Another very important element of youth is its intersectionality. So all the consultations I've been mentioning prior to the summit include, as I said, youth from the global source, the global north. Another key issue within youth is gender, as was mentioned by Margarita. They are fighting a lot for gender equality. So it's related to inclusion and intersectionality. If you look at the outcome of the summit, there are 5 actions where youth is mentioned. Action 20 on international peace and security. And again, I can agree, it looks like much more less important than military measures, but still youth is mentioned for the international agenda on youth, peace and security. And I have lots of colleagues working on youth and peace. And their studies show that including youth in peace building and peacekeeping really makes a difference. And excluding youth also is problematic, because if you want to have long-term peace, then you need also to include younger age groups. Youth is then mentioned in 4 actions on the section 4, youth and future generations, and there 4 things. First, action 34, youth is recognized as a potential. Action 34, sorry. Action 35, youth is mentioned with regards to human rights, and that's very important. I'm going to explain why in a few seconds. Action 36 requires meaningful youth participation at the national level, and action 37, sorry, meaningful youth participation at the international level. Usually the United Nations has been framing youth as potential. So that's action 34. This is why I'm not really surprised that it comes first, and with the idea that you can implement the UN agenda as it is and not necessarily change it. Where I see a major breakthrough is Action 35, which recognizes the importance of human rights and also human rights of youth. Because as you said, youth have been for long sidelines in international negotiations. If, I don't know, I was not attending the summit, but I guess looking at the age of the diplomatic representatives there, very few people were under 35. And this can only be done if you really recognize the rights of these young people, and also with again, for intersectionality, indigenous youth, for instance, are very key at the international level. The Declaration on Future Generations, very briefly, one key element, it has been mentioned, I think by Pam, is this idea of the creation of a special envoy on future generations. What is also very interesting is that we have a clear target or deadline here, because there will be a special conference to follow up on this during the 83rd General Assembly meeting. So I agree also with Margarita. I think this is what she said, that very few targets have clear, let's say, checkpoints, but this one has one, and that's very important. So a lot of breakthrough for youth, but of course we will have to see whether they're efficient or not, and I think that's the next question.
Thanks. It's also a topic for future research. Thanks very much, Amandine. Over to Caroline again.
Yes, thanks, Thomas. And a final question for the second round to Sébastien. So at ISRI, you study the role of multilateral banks in driving transformation towards sustainability. So you've touched upon this already, but could you elaborate a bit more on the main outcomes of the summit related to financing for development and the main obstacles towards this that you have identified in your research?
Thank you very much, Caroline. And I try to be to the things that are different from what was already mentioned on that part of the pact. As I said before, it's complicated because a lot of the decisions are made actually in other settings in Washington and by ministries of finance and not the ministries of foreign affairs, be it in G20 settings or in the Washington settings. But I think there are nevertheless important messages, like political statements that do matter, for instance, on changing the governance of these Bretton Woods institutions. It's not new, but it's important that this has been stated in the Pact for the Future, because that's a starting point that is very important for a lot of Southern countries in those settings, and we could continue work in that direction. Nevertheless, the US is completely opposed to that, and I don't see how that's going to change anyway. But so we have some point of that this statement matters. On debt, for instance, that was also mentioned, I think, by Margarita, something very important for many Southern countries. The IMF or the Paris Club on debt is a major type of setting where this is discussed, but also the G20, where there has been a discussion to include also China in the discussion about debt, because a lot of the debt is also now to China, be public Chinese companies or public institutions or private companies or semi-public companies in China. And so this common framework under the G20 is a very delicate type of diplomatic effort. And I think what is, again, very important is that the UN has been, the UN setting has been sending messages about the fact that we need to change the debt architecture and continue supporting the effort that is done by having China around the table. But it's very, I mean, the implementation of that, again, is not, it depends a lot on how the people who have, the countries of the G20 that have signed up to this declaration in the pact are actually going to play the game in the G20 setting. So the consistency between these countries in what they say in New York and what they will do in the G20 setting is going to matter particularly. I just want to insist on a few very technical issues. One is the statement that is done on a new attitude towards risks. And I think that's a very important statement, again, to be implemented, but that matters a lot in terms of how the perception and the evaluation of risks particularly when it comes to investing in African countries or in southern countries, and how that risk is sometimes overestimated by the credit rating agencies, but also by the multilateral development bank systems. And so that's something that I think was also a very important statement to be made. The insistence on concessional finance arrangements, and we know that there is going to be a reconstitution of the IDA, so one of the key instruments of the World Bank for concessional finance, so that the money that matters most for the poorest of the countries. And that discussion is very important, with a statement about the allocation of that money, particularly to vulnerable countries and vulnerable communities. I mentioned this issue of vulnerability because this is a very difficult conversation to be held also even in the climate COP settings. To what extent can we direct specifically, and even in the biodiversity COP setting that we will see in the next 2 weeks in Cali, to what extent can we allocate more of the very concessional money to the most vulnerable countries and communities? That's a conversation that is going to be very important, and it's good that the pact has given a signal on that. So I was mentioning a few elements that these statements is very important, but all depends on how the countries that have signed up to that are actually going to make that a reality in the other decision-making centers like the G20 or the Washington institutions, where they have to really make that a reality.
Thank you, Sébastien. So yeah, it remains to be seen whether commitments will translate into action. Thanks again to our panelists for answering our more detailed questions. I now hand over to Thomas for the final round.
Thanks, and yeah, Sébastien, what you just said in the final statement, I think is a good transition to the third question we have for you. And then we would like, again, to invite people from the audience to ask their questions, or we have Ishan tomorrow with the Q&A box. So we would like to ask one final question to all of you, but we also wanted to save time for the Q&A. So let's try to keep it to 1 or 2 minutes, your response. And it's a quite big question, so it might be a challenge to answer quickly, but still, it would be nice. So the question is, we have now this pact of the future, but the question is, where do we go from here? And how do you think is this pact of the future impacting the development of a post-2030 agenda? So again, big question, but please keep it short to have enough time for the other questions from the audience. And we can maybe start in the opposite order. So Sébastien, maybe you can continue. And please keep it short and then hand over to the next person.
Yeah, I think one of my key elements was already mentioned is we have this financing for development conference in Seville in July next year, and that's a key moment to see if we are able to really make a change in the way we are going to have the financial means to implement Agenda 2030. But again, this is a UN conference, meaning New York piloted by UNDESA. And we need to be sure that the ministries of finance of the different countries are part of the conversation. In Paris, it's the DG Treasury is really piloting that conversation. So they are really watching what's happening there. And I just can mention that on this preparation, we see also a lot of defensive positions from northern countries rather than trying to have a positive project to make that, to implement the pact. Defensive meaning trying to avoid that the language on debt is not reasonable or too much influenced by Russia, etc. So that is what I mean by defensive. So I see a lot of problem in preparing that financing for development, and we need, I mean, we don't have a lot of new important milestones for this reform of the international financial architecture, because it will go on and on every spring summit, spring meetings, and annual meetings every year. But what is the key political moment where we will take this system accountable?
Thanks. Amandine, how would you position the Summit of the Future in the roadmap to a 2030 agenda? What is your impression? You're still muted, please unmute.
Sorry, maybe I pressed 2 times.
Yeah.
So very quickly. I think it's always important to have the adoption of international declarations like the Pact and its annexes, because they always serve as an official compass, an official way to follow on which other activities can be organized. So I agree, the Pact is not perfect, but I think it's going to be used. To be honest, if I look at what has been adopted for use, I think I have two major reactions. First, a number of measures that are indicated are not new at all. If I look at action on youth meaningful participation at the national level, the Pact mentions the importance to include youth in national delegations to the United Nations. This is absolutely not new. I mean, it's the youth program has been existing for decades already. So it really looks like something that is not going to make a difference. But I mentioned, to the contrary, a number of new things like this approach on rights that can help, indeed, maybe end a number of even discrimination that exists against youth worldwide. And just to finish, I think there was also a tension among youth groups in addressing future generations and not present ones. And it's problematic for two things. First, because there is no clear distinction between the two. There seems to be like the future generations and present people, but they're actually absolutely not so distinct one from the other. And where the boundary is also an interesting issue. And the other problem is that, of course, for future generations, I mean, political theory or philosophy has been working on the non-identity problem, which is we cannot know what is good for future generations or not. So within youth, there are also been debates about why isn't this pact also addressing present generations? And when I say that, it's not just youth, it's all age groups. We still have problems for our world decisions to be reflective of the different age groups. The SDGs do not necessarily have indicators that are counted for the different age groups. If you look at decision making, age groups are not evenly distributed. So maybe a key new agenda to push would be, I mean, it's good to have a declaration on future generations. We could also work more on present generations and how they work together.
Thanks. Margarita, from your perspective, also representing the interests of the Global South, would you see the Pact for the Future as a milestone or rather a smaller stone?
Thank you, Thomas. What a challenge to say how can we move forward in the next years. But I just want to highlight three key messages. My first message is that this is a historical pact, and we need to consider as it is. And I think that what is the main challenge for me, and I have said that in my three interventions, is how can we move from the process to translate words into action. And here I'm gonna bring my the representation that I have of 70 think tanks in the Global South. And we think that it's an opportunity here to close the gap between evidence and policy and to really break silos, apply more innovative methodologies to create collective intelligence, to do participatory methodologies, to have more voices in the process about how can we move from the words to actions. And the second thing is like also in this message about closing the gap between words and action is considering local policies and local contexts when we are talking about global challenges. And that's something that sometimes is missed there, or when we talk about implementation. So that's my first message. The second message is the importance of building bridges between the milestones of the next year. So we have the international, many international spaces and forums happening. We have the Commission of the State of Women. We have the Financing for Development, the COP29, and the G20. And these are key opportunities to make more actionable what has already been said in the path of the future. For example, in the G20, Brazil is planning to launch the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, and this is an opportunity to connect with the path. Then we have next year, the G20 is going to be led by South Africa, and this is also an opportunity to maybe taking the G20 back to the basis and pushing a little more on the agenda of financing for development. We have the COP, we have Beijing, where also there is a huge opportunity to make words more actionable. And as Sebastian already mentioned, financing for development. And my final message is there is a huge opportunity for partnerships. And here, think tanks, research centers, academia, civil society can play an important role to collaborate and to make the path a reality. Thank you.
Thanks, Margarita, once again. Over to Pam. How would you position the Pact of the Future and the trajectory towards post-2030 agenda?
I'm going to focus on a few other meetings as well, and a few other things that have to happen between now and 2030. First, just to follow up on the Financing for Development Conference that'll be in Sevilla next summer, is we have to remember that the last Financing for Development Conference, those negotiations were going on in parallel to the SDGs, and the entire financing section of the SDGs was essentially lifted from the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. That was the output from that. So that hasn't gotten us anywhere. Will this next Financing for Development Conference get us any more forward on this? I don't know. There's also going to be a social summit, the second social summit in 2025. The first social summit was held way back many years ago. And have we heard anything about it since? No, not really. A lot of those issues pervaded through the SDGs, but there wasn't a lot. Now that we have the SDGs, will the social summit work towards advancing them? We'll have to wait and see. The next SDG summit at the heads of state level is in 2027, which is the last one before 2030. The Pact for the Future invites the high-level political forum under the auspices of the General Assembly to consider in September 2027, how will we advance sustainable development by 2030 and beyond? So what's going to happen in that in terms of, are there going to be negotiations of new goals? Are they going to extend 2030 agenda? Are they going to add in new indicators or new targets? We don't know. All we know is that with it, it's a crapshoot basically of whether you're going to get something better or worse. Then one other thing that I wanted to, well, two other things quickly. One is the next Secretary General is going to be elected, and so in 2026, and that will also have an impact depending on who she will be. And finally, the continuation of wars in Ukraine, the Middle East, Sudan will also potentially impact the ability to achieve consensus going forward and takes resources and time and energy away from sustainable development.
Thanks, Pam. Very insightful. And over to Mariana. I'm sure you will follow many of these events. I wonder what you think about the impact of the Summit for the Future and Pact of the Future for the next phase.
Right, 3 points. Let me start with the quote that Pam used from the Pact for the Future, because she pointed out that the Pact for the Future itself speaks about this when inviting participants in the SDG Summit in September 27 to consider how to continue how we will advance sustainable development by 2030 and beyond. And this is my first point. I like this language by 2030 and beyond much better than all the talk of a post-2030 agenda, because it signals an ongoing and hopefully accelerating efforts now and then. So, you know, we don't have this break and then we negotiate something new, maybe for many years. In the end, everybody's dissatisfied with the result. And but, you know, by 2030 and beyond, I think that is the much better language. And also the pact itself talks about follow-up and review. So it sort of suggests not only the pact, but also the digital compact, they all suggest a twofold approach to the follow-up and review of the 556 actions that you can find in the pact and the many other commitments in the annex documents. They say, first, use all existing relevant fora for implementation, follow-up and review. And we have heard already many of those, right? We have heard about the HLPF, we have heard about FFD4, the Financing for Development Forum next year, the big conference, the Second World Social Summit. We have heard about more informal meetings like the Hamburg Sustainability Conference. Next one will be in June next year. And this is then combined with high-level reviews by heads of state and government at the General Assembly. And for example, for the Pact for the Future, we have language saying that we'll have a meeting at the level of heads of state and government at the beginning of the 83rd session of the General Assembly. And that is 1 year after the next SDG summit, that is in September 28. So we have, so to speak, a roadmap to work on this. We start discussing, and that was very clear, the G77 made it very clear they want to only start discussing anything beyond 2030 in 27, not now and not in the next 2 years, but only start with this in 2027. And then the next year we'll have the follow-up of this more enabling environment. And I think it's a good roadmap to do it in this way.
Thanks so much for all your answers, comments, and insights. And with that, I would like to hand over to Yishan, who has been following the Q&A, and let's see whether we have good questions.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Thank you for all panelists. We have 4 questions in the Q&A. So I'll, of course, invite all our participants. If you have more questions, please feel free to type. But let's see, we have about 10 minutes, so we can cover them. So probably I'll invite those who type their question, if you want to unmute yourself. I think our host can help. And so the first question is from Philip Anger. I don't know if you are there, if you want to ask your question by yourself. Okay, I think maybe there is a technical issue here. Let's see if we can resolve. So Blake, if you can, maybe I'll see if we can pass to. Oh, I think we can have Philip. Maybe you can ask your question. Okay.
Yes, maybe now you hear me?
Yeah, good.
All right, great.
Please
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
Yes, yeah, what came to my mind was like the opportunity for the intensive process of working together, for example, Germany and Namibia. What is the outcome on like, if you put your heads together, probably now they are able to work together better. So what can be beneficial of all these work, these groups put together, and maybe even expanded to civil society cooperation, where I started to organize some things. So this is why this question came up. Are there any experiences with that? Thank you.
Thank you. Pam, I see you are smiling. I think you want to take the question.
Let me take it quickly. That it's really a mixed bag. Usually for these processes, for even in the MEAs, they assign a developed country chair, co-chair, and a developing country co-chair. The purpose of those co-chairs is twofold. One, to ensure trust in the process so that just not one side is being represented. And second, to hopefully have people who are going to be able to work for the process rather than for the interest of their own countries. Sometimes this results in closer cooperation at the UN, because you have to remember these are the ambassadors and their staff based in New York rather than in capital. Sometimes this results in more problems, and that you find that those ambassadors are unable to work together in the future, or they've seen sides of the other country that just make it very difficult on a personal basis. And so a lot of this is much more personal than it is country cooperation, in my opinion.
Thank you, Pam. I hope that answers the question. If I don't see any other panelists who wants to answer, let's just move to the next question, I think raised by Hristo Tokova, who is also a member of our task force about the SDG framework. So Hristo, I think you can speak if you want and ask your question. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. Thanks all the panelists for giving their insights on the outcomes of the summit. So I'll go directly to the question, and my question is maybe to Marianne. You mentioned very positive signs regarding this enabling environment on the SDGs implementation. So my question is about were there some questions about the adequacy of the SDG framework itself? Because we've talked about a lot about it in our previous meetings, and especially given that this SDG framework seems not to be working very good, especially given this, let's say, these timelines and expectation of what goals to achieve by 2030. So my question is, let's put it simply, is was the SDG framework itself challenged during the summit somehow? Thank you.
Right, I take it right away, okay, to save some time. I would say the SDG framework itself, in terms of structure and indicators, wasn't part of the discussions, really. It wasn't in the center of the debate, because also we just had the SDG summit in the previous year. But of course, the midterm review showed that we only achieved, last year it was 15%, this year it is 17% of the goals are on track. So in terms of the means of implementation and the way forward, we know that we need to accelerate. And that's why the focus was more on how to enable this kind of accelerated implementation. So not the SDG framework as such, but you could say, of course, those parts in SDG 17 discussing means of implementation, that was very much discussed in the first chapter of the pact, everything around finance and other means of implementation as well, like science, technology, innovation. That was definitely part of the discussions, and everything else was sort of moved to 2027 when member states agreed that they would discuss this in the next SDG summit.
Thank you, Mariana. I think let's move to, for the sake of time, to the next question. John Thompson, and I think you put quite a few comments there. It's about interlinkages of the SDGs. John, would you like to speak and raise your question?
Hello, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Sorry, I just seem to have been cut off there. Yeah, I was talking about the fact that the statement, the pact, seems to be talking quite a lot about the importance and the need for interlinkages and for addressing more than one SDG at the same time. Lots of talk about mobilizing science, technology, innovation, and so on. And coming back to this point about lagging on the SDGs, that's exactly the point about how do we accelerate action at scale. And the pact seemed to point to that as an opportunity. And there was some constructive dialogue. What I see is missing now, and looking at the events going forward, some that have been described, is do we have a kind of set of activities and initiatives that will concentrate minds and identify where are these synergy drivers, as we call them here at Sussex Sustainability. Where can we find these policies and measures that are going to accelerate action on 2 or more SDGs at scale? And I'd welcome thoughts from the panel on that.
Thank you, John. Maybe I'll give this question first to Margarita, if you want to take. I know you've been working on several SDGs. I think you're probably in a good position to share some thoughts.
Thank you, Chishan. So I think that what I see as some opportunities are the milestone and the international fora that I already mentioned, where there is, I think that we are already moving a little more on thinking on, for example, like climate change and finance. And I think that also, for example, gender, care economy, and finance. So I think that in these spaces is where we are starting to connect a little more, like the intersectionality of different SDGs, that they are connected. And I was in a meeting with the new scientific advisory board of the Secretary General, where these discussions are taking place, where they are bringing different voices and different experts talk about how can we connect and how can we create a set of goals that are more interconnected and not like all of them very separate. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add some thoughts? Amandine, do you have anything to add?
No, yeah, I was just going to say that I think youth is very transversal. And the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth has always been paying attention to link different sustainable development goals together. Like we mentioned climate change, and I think Sebastian mentioned the biodiversity COP that is coming soon, and they're trying to make links between climate change and biodiversity measures. So yeah, it's an easy answer for me, but I think youth, for instance, is a good entry point to create these synergy drivers.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. We have the last question in the Q&A box. I don't know who asked that question, so I'm just going to read. It's about the businesses. So the question is that beyond scaling up support for the SDGs through financing, investment, and public-private partnerships, what are other strategies that can enhance the private sector's contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals? This is important, especially given that the SDGs are often viewed as niche compared to other frameworks such as ESG. So what steps can businesses take to drive significant progress towards 2030 and beyond? So maybe I'll give this question first to Sebastian, because you've talked a lot about the financing.
Thank you, Isian. And I try to be short because we have just 1 minute left. I think this is a very important question, and it also relates to the former one. I would have said that a lot of the discussions in how to finance the SDGs is not so much to finance them individually, but also to ensure that we have an alignment of investments with co-benefits on the multiple SDGs. And we've seen some progress in public development banks in the way that they use alignment with SDGs as something that makes sense and that is not considered just niche compared to ESG, but as something that can drive their strategy. And we've been trying to see to what extent private financial players were interested in the SDG framework. And I think I concur with the anonymous audience person who was asking the question, that this is not percolating that much in the private financial sector. We've seen SDG bonds being issued, etc. So there have been trials of that, but we see also a lot of interest by finance people coming to the biodiversity COP, trying to see how they could have commitments on climate and biodiversity and inequalities, etc., etc. So it's as if they were telling again the story of SDGs and trying to make frameworks that can translate the SDGs into something that they can swallow as financial players. So my point is probably to say we need to work on the how the public development banks can be influential in linking what their process of aligning with the Agenda 2030 and make that a reality in their links with the private financial sector. But my last caveat is to say a lot of the private financial players are saying that working with the multilateral development banks is just a nightmare because they are not thinking like private players. So this is my way forward, but I'm not very optimistic about the speed of that change.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. I'm very mindful of time. I would like to thank all panelists for their very important insights. I think we've learned a lot in the last an hour and a half, and definitely I think this is just an opportunity for us to think about this question, the challenges ahead of us, and then how we can work together. Of course, we want to continue this conversation. So I just want to remind people who are interested in the work of our task force on the SDGs. We will have a task force meeting also during this ESG forum on Friday, the last day of the forum at 10:30 Central European time, and you can register with the forum, and then you can get access to that meeting. And it will be a meeting for us to discuss our work plan about the SDGs and then how we can work together to also support the SDG implementation. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And thanks again to our panelists.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice to see
Bye. Thank you.
you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Blake.